Okay, let's build a VPC with some IaC and maybe a little TLC. And oh, that's enough. In our last lab, we went and built a VPC using the AWS console. And we went into detail on the different pieces and we built it from hand. We didn't use one of the wizards. This week, we're going to build the exact same VPC again because we deleted the last one, except this time we're going to use infrastructure as code. And so this is great. The lab's going to teach us two things. One is it's going to get you more familiar with how infrastructure as code works. And I don't expect you to write your own yet, but you're definitely going to learn better ways to read and understand that infrastructure as code. The other part of this is when you build things with the console, it'll take some shortcuts for you. You don't realize that it's kind of automatically generating certain things. When you build it through the command line or through infrastructure as code, making the API calls directly, then you have to build each of those things piece by piece. That's what we're going to do today. And I'm going to start by going over IaC just a little bit. Then I'm going to walk through everything we're going to build. Then in the lab itself, you can choose to copy and paste as much or as little as you want, lay it out. You'll deploy your brand new VPC. When we're done, we're going to delete it. But you know what? That template's still going to be there. We can redeploy and have that VPC whenever we want. And we're not going to have to pay for it when we're not actually working on the labs, which is the real reason we're getting into this. Okay, let's talk a little bit briefly about infrastructure as code. With infrastructure as code, and again, we had a lab about this a while ago, but what it does is it allows you to use a template. It's really a declarative language. You're telling the infrastructure as code system, this is what I want you to build. You're not telling it how you want it to build that. You're just giving it all the details of exactly what you want that outcome to be. Then that infrastructure as code platform, and I'll go over what the two main platforms are in a moment, that's going to take that and it's going to use its intelligence and make all those API calls for you and actually build out what you want. And it's going to build it in the right order and it's going to understand internal references. And we're going to get to all of that in a little bit. Now, there's two main platforms when you're working with AWS that people tend to use. One, and the one that we use for these labs is built in. That's called CloudFormation. And we had our previous labs where we've used CloudFormation for different things. CloudFormation, I like it for these labs because we don't need to set anything up. You just go right in, you go into the CloudFormation part of the console, or you could actually run it via API, and it all runs and executes within AWS itself. The other is Terraform. Terraform is more versatile, and that's by HashiCorp, and that's a commercial company, but there's open source versions of Terraform, and I'm not going to get into the politics of that because it's actually changing a lot right now. But anyway, with Terraform, you could write infrastructure as code that works across multiple different kinds of cloud platforms, and there's all sorts of plugins, so it's a more versatile tool. The problem is you have to have some place to run your Terraform. And we're not there yet in our labs. I haven't given you a place where you can run your Terraform yet. You could run it on your computer, but you all have different computers, and I'm not here to fix your computers when you can't make it run. We'll get there. There's automation tools and stuff that we'll use. So for our lab, we're going to stick with CloudFormation. Now, you might have heard of things like CDK, Amazon's Cloud Development Kit, or, well, there's other ones out there. That's where you kind of intermingle, use a coding language. It's like a software development kit, but for building your cloud. And what it does in the back end, though, it's usually just going to convert it to CloudFormation, and that's what gets sent off to Amazon. But there's a lot of like other pieces of it and a lot of other automation, really beyond the scope of what we're doing today, because our focus is more on networks and VPCs. So one last quick thing, we're going to jump over to the whiteboard for this piece, and I want to talk about in terms of the different kinds of language that we use for CloudFormation. Then we're going to get into the building itself. All right, jump to the whiteboard. Okay, with infrastructure as code, it's almost always some form of either JSON or YAML. And YAML files, you'll often see they might just be called YML at the end. Wow, my handwriting is even worse than normal this week. Now, this is a brief comparison of what these look like. So these two statements are equivalent. Those are equal. On the left, I've got my JSON, and on the right, I have my YAML. Now, even Terraform and any other kind of IaC thing will typically use its own versions of this, and these are things you need to be familiar with. What's the key difference? Well, YAML is a superset of JSON. So you can actually dump JSON code inside of YAML, and it will work if you do things right. But YAML itself, as you can see, look how much more compact and how much cleaner that is. Here we have all of the characters that we need to worry about. And we covered, kind of a lot of JSON when we were doing our IAM policies. So just know that within CloudFormation, both of these can work. And even though we've spent a lot more time on JSON because of our IAM stuff for this lab, and for most of the CloudFormation, I'm going to choose YAML because just look, it's a lot cleaner and easier to read. Now, things matter, like the spacing of these little bits and pieces will matter, and that's all right because everything we're going to use is going to have syntax checkers that's going to check it all for you. So I don't even need to worry about what these are. Just understand, like you notice in this case, it's properties, and over here it's properties. Pretty much the same thing, except we don't have those characters. Tags, key value, tags, key value. So just different ways of documenting the same information, even though they're separate languages. Okay, let's get into our actual templates themselves. And what I've done is I've taken the CloudFormation template that I built. Okay, I didn't build it. I told ChatGPT to build it for me. It actually did a really good job, and it ran it right away and just saved me a lot of typing. It doesn't always work out that well. Anyway, this is the one we're going to use, but I've broken it up into different pieces. We'll show you the whole template as we get into the lab itself. I'm going to walk you through piece by piece what this does, what this CloudFormation is going to build for us. And I've built it all in order. So to really show you how we actually structurally build a VPC. And in this case, you're going to see some of the internals that we missed last week by doing it all on the console. Okay, so let's start. And like any of these things, you always need kind of a header at the top. This is just telling us really two things. And this is, again, is that YAML. One is that template version. And hopefully you don't hear this as I move my iPad into a better spot here. And then the other is the description. The template version, that's required. The description is optional, but it's usually good to have that in there. Then we're going to have everything else that you see is going to be in this resources. That's what we're telling our system, the infrastructure as code, CloudFormation, to build. There's other ones that you can have in here that we're not going to talk about. An example is parameters, which are, you can actually input things that you have users have to fill in before they run it every time, or you can pull variables from different places. Our infrastructure as code today, our CloudFormation template is very simple. So the only main section we're going to have is the resources section. Now, this is a comment, standard comment language. And the first thing that we're actually building is our Cloudflare VPC. Let me actually do this a little bit better. So in the infrastructure as code, that's the, I guess we could call it the name. It's the name in the IaC template. It's not the name that's actually going to be used, but this is how we can reference this. And why does that matter? Well, I'll get into why you need to reference different things in the VPCs in just a moment. The next important part is the type. And the type is, what are we actually building? So AWS, EC2, VPC, that's what defines that type. You can find all of those in the documentation. So I don't expect you to remember it. I don't remember these all the time. I know some of them. Usually I use tools and previous templates to help me build. But every one of these is going to have that name. And you know what? Amazon probably has a syntax thing that they call it. I'm not going to go look that up right now just for time's sake. It's effectively the name. Then it's always going to have the type. What are we building? So what is it called? What do we refer to it as? What are we building? Then what are the properties? And the properties are going to be required. So there's certain properties that you always have to have, and others are going to be optional. So there's optional properties as well that are things that you don't have to have in there. It just depends on what you're doing. In our case, we have 3 required properties, and this should look really familiar because we built it in the last lab. What is the IP address range. And then you'll notice this DNS stuff here, DNS support and DNS host names. So that's required. And last week it was just done auto for us. So just the nature of doing it in the console, that's one of the things that it hid from us. But if you go to try to build the VPC without those, it's going to go womp womp and not let you go ahead and do that. Okay, or I guess I'll leave that there. Then we have some optional pieces. And notice how the name tag, what you see in the console, it's just a tag. And the console is, and so I'm going to call this the console name. The tags are usually used for name. Only a few things in AWS have a direct property that's the name. Everything else, a name's just a tag. Because if you think about it, Amazon's already creating all of these unique IDs like VPC123 for us, or Internet Gateway, IGW dash, whatever those long batch of characters are. It's already doing that for everything. It has its own internal unique name. The name tags, it's just so we know what to call it. The console will actually do a lot of this automatically for you. It applies name tags, it reads name tags, it shows name tags. Really, you don't have to have name tags there. And if you build something without name tags, you can see it in the console and it looks a little ugly or it's just got a blank. Okay, back to it. So this is the core. So the first thing we built here is we defined the VPC itself. And that's all you need to define the VPC. Of course, it is a totally worthless VPC because there's nothing in there for us to use yet. So let's scroll down a little bit and start building out the other pieces of it. Now, one of the things that we built first thing, we built our internet gateway automatically in the console. We didn't really have to do much for it. In this case, there's two pieces to the internet gateway. This is an important concept. If we look, we've defined the internet gateway itself. Remember, that's just a comment, so I know what I'm looking at. And within that internet gateway, notice how simple it is. So we have the name of it, the Cloud.SL Internet Gateway. Remember, that's just within the CloudFormation template, the reference. Then we have the type, which is an internet gateway. And then we have the properties, which is the name that we're going to see showing up in the console. That's cool. But is that in the VPC or not? And the way this is written right now, that is not in the VPC because we haven't linked it to the VPC yet. It's a separate resource. We have to tell Amazon, build this internet gateway and attach it to the VPC. And we do that with the next little bit below because there's a resource known as a gateway attachment. And the gateway attachment, oh, I meant to underline, I didn't mean to scroll over it. There we go. The gateway attachment is the thing that says it links together the VPC and it links together the internet gateway. Now this is, I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this one because there's some important things going on here. And come on, zoom in on for me. All right. And maybe I'm not zooming in right now because my system froze a little bit in the wrong way. So, but I'll go ahead and heck, you can see it. So let me go back here and clean out those lines. Notice in the properties, these two things, the VPC ID and the internet gateway. And notice this thing, it's an exclamation mark REF. That is part of the syntax of CloudFormation templates. And that means I want to refer to something else. Now, why does this matter and why are we using it here? Well, think about what I said before. When you create something, you're not telling CloudFormation what order to create things in necessarily, and you're not going to have the ID of that internet gateway. You're saying create the internet gateway. You don't have the ID, so you've got nothing to actually link into using this attachment, using the VPC gateway attachment object or resource. Because to use that, you have to know what the ID of the gateway is, and you have to know what the ID of the VPC is. This is cool. So this ref is, CloudFormation knows, oh, first I need to go ahead and build the internet gateway and the VPC. And when I do that, I need to pull those IDs out after I've built them so that I can use those in other places in the template as I build out the other pieces. And that's what this exclamation mark ref does. It means refer to, and in this case, CloudFormation VPC, and that is the name all the way up here of, oops, that's the Internet Gateway. Well, I circled that one anyway. So that Internet Gateway one, we have the reference to using that name. It says refer to that. And so for this Internet Gateway ID, this little magic, that ref is going to pull that ID and it's going to insert it there when it's making the API calls to build things out. Okay, so that's that ref, and we didn't use that before, but that is how CloudFormation can understand and pull the different IDs. And what's cool is it will generally use its own brains to build things in the right order as it sees those reference requirements. That's all part of how it works. Okay, so let me on the side here just right quickly what we've got going on. And that is, so far, what we've built out is we've built out our VPC, which had nothing in it. We built out our Internet Gateway, and then we did an attachment so that that Internet Gateway and that VPC are now connected. Now, there's another core thing, and I mentioned this briefly if you were looking before, which is we need this DHCP options set. This is just some networking stuff so that things on the network know where to get the information they need. And the big one is the domain names. And so for those internal names of things, and are there any DNS servers? And in this case, we're using Amazon's DNS server. So that's going to basically, if I say go to google.com, oops, I shouldn't say that in an Amazon thing. If I say go to google.com, that's going to return 8.8.8.8, just like normal domain name servers always work. Plus, this one's going to give us our internal names of our resources. And then the only other thing we did is we applied a name to it. And then, as before, you notice we have one of our referencings because the two things we created here are the option set. I'm just going to call it option set. And then we have the attachment. So that is now attaching that back up to the VPC as well. So that's just some core networking stuff. There's other things that we could have put in there. We could have put in like a time server. There's not a ton of things, but if you're running in a large enterprise environment, you might want to be more specific and like point to some of your own internal DHCPs or DNS servers. This allows you to do that. All right. Well, now we're going to start getting to some of the fun. So at this point, everything above here that we've built is giving us our core VPC. That's the stuff we have to have. Now, of course, that VPC is really worthless without any subnets because you have to have a subnet to deploy in something. So in this one, we have two different subnets. I have both of our public subnets. And since these are identical, I'm only going to describe the top one here. And we're going to learn about another little thing that we have available to us within CloudFormation templates. Okay, so the first thing is you should see this by now. So we know that's the name, and we know that's what we're building as a subnet. And then we get into the properties. And the reference means, cool, build this subnet as part of our CloudFormation VPC. Really obvious. And then right below that is our IP address range. And if you notice, that's exactly the same one we used last week when we were building it in the console, 100.0.1.0/24. But then we get into something a little bit different here. And we have this exclamation mark select. So let me see if I can draw that select. And then we have get AZs. And what we're doing here, that's almost unreadable, but what we're doing here is two different things. So I'm going to start with the get AZs. I'm going to actually build this out in reverse. And what get AZs is this is a function. This is just something that AWS built into CloudFormation because we need to know our availability zones. If you remember last week, I mentioned availability zones kind of change all the time, and it depends on what region you're in, how many they are, what they are. This is a really elegant way is that function says, give me all the availability zones. So if there's 4, it's going to give you 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's going to give you the IDs, whatever you need to actually define those availability zones. So again, it's just a function CloudFormation built in to make our lives easier. Okay, well, I'm going to get the availability zones, Then I want to select one of those. So this says select the first one on the list of what's returned by that function. And that's all it does. So it's a way of saying, hey, give me the first one on the list. And you'll notice down here, we pick the second one on the list. Yeah, you might think one is one and two is two, but only if you've never actually coded before. And when you get a list, we start counting at zero in programming languages. Don't blame me. I didn't write them. I'm not smart enough. Okay. So that's the cool additional thing that we've got going on here is for our subnets, we have our required things that we need are the required elements are the VPC ID, the IP address range, and our availability zone. And this really maps to what we did last week. Now we have two optional pieces. One is, do I want to give everything that runs in here a public IP address on launch? You might actually not usually want that. I turn it on a lot for labs to make life easier because if I deploy in a public subnet, I want it to have a public IP address so I can access it. You don't have to. You can have a public subnet and not give something a public IP address, which is really cool. And it can still talk to the internet. A little more advanced concept we're going to get into, but now you can start seeing how we can really tune our VPCs a lot more. Now, that one you could also set up in the console. We kind of breezed through that last week and we stuck with the defaults. With the infrastructure as code, you have to put it in there or not. But that's optional. If you don't put that in there, it will not automatically assign public IP address to what deploys. Then below that, we just have our name tag. So S.L.A.W public 1, S.L.A.W public 2. All right. Well, that's great. We have our two public subnets now that are part of our same VPC. So now let's review again where we are. We have our VPC, we have our internet gateway, and we have those attached together with an attachment. Then we built out a couple of things our VPC needs, and it's the DHCP option set. And checking my notes here to make sure I have all of the, yep, that's the main stuff that we needed. Okay, then that's the core of our VPC. Then, oh, by the way, you don't have to have an internet gateway. Internet gateways are optional only if you want to allow internet access. You can have a totally private network if you want. We will build some of those later. You won't be able to do a whole lot with it, but we're going to build it. And we might even show you some internal connectivity, some of the more advanced networking stuff. So that is not a minimum requirement. The option set is, but the actual internet gateway is not. It's just typically we use those in a large number, and especially for our labs because we're doing everything over the internet. All right. Then we built out our subnets, and we built out our subnets first with our public. And as part of the subnet, we learned how to do that, use the functions so that we can get our availability zones. But there's still more that we need. And the next thing we need is our private subnet. Now notice this looks pretty much identical to the public, except for one thing. Remember we had some other little thing here? Yeah, if I scroll back up, that other little thing here is, whoops, I went too hard, map public IP on launch. We don't have that here because we're never going to give the private subnets an IP address. So that was an option. And now you get to see that that was an optional property, not a mandatory property. Going down though, what are we missing? Yeah, we're missing our route tables. If you remember, there's no way for traffic to move anywhere and route tables are required. Now, to make things easy for us, there's actually a default that was built when we create the VPC. It's going to be built automatically, happens in the console, happens with infrastructure as code. We are not going to use that one, and this will make sense when you actually look at this visually. So for a route table, notice that we have a public and a private route table, and really there's nothing there except what VPC is it in and what's the name. You don't really need a lot, except we are going to need to link those route tables to our subnets. Each of those, remember, for a lot of these objects, we're going to have, we either call it an attachment or an association. Association. And in this case, it's called an association. So associate the route table with the subnet. And so for public subnet 1, we're telling it this subnet use the public route table. This subnet, use the public route table. For public subnet number, or for private subnets, same thing, except in this case, we're using the private route tables in both cases. All it's saying is, this is the route, hey, you subnet, this is your route table. And you build it after you build the subnets. All right. Well, then we need to know, we don't have any routes. We just have these empty tables. Now, I will tell you there is one rule that is built in by default into all of these route tables. So every one of the route tables by default will say, whoops, let me write this out the proper way. In our case, because of our IP range, 10.0.0.0/16 is going to route to local. Local. You saw this last week when we built out, those routes were there. That is a default route that's built in. You don't have to keep it. You can get rid of that, but it's always going to be there in default when you create the route table. And if you do it via code, infrastructure as code, that one route is always automatically there. You would have to go in after the fact to get rid of it. By the way, that's annoying to do with infrastructure as code. There might be a way to override it. I haven't had to do that yet, and I'll probably research that for a future lab. All right, back to our actual routes and what we're looking at. And the routes are really easy. So I just wrote out, this route here, what that would look like. Well, for our public route, so we have it's a public route. The type is a route. It depends on. So why does it have this? For some things, you want to make sure that if there is a dependency, sometimes CloudFormation can figure it out without you telling it. Other cases, you have to specify what that dependency is. And in this case, it is not going to build this unless it has this dependency in place. And that dependency is, so first is what route table are we, where are we building this rule? So that's defining what that route table is. And the second is, what is the destination? So what, remember in a route table, you define if this thing is trying to go to this destination, route it this way. Well, in this case is if it's going to the internet, I want to route it to my internet gateway. Nice and simple. And that, again, is a public subnet. Public subnets route internet traffic to an internet gateway, and they have an internet gateway attached for the possibility of inbound traffic. Well, what about our private subnet? Remember, you don't have to have a private subnet connect to the internet. In our case, we're using a NAT gateway. This matches what we did in that last lab. And we have to do this in 3 pieces. That's what we've got laid out here. Let me get all kind of, I do have all 3 on the screen right now. So piece number 1 is I need an internet IP address. And in our lab last week, the console, we could kind of just pick it right then and there. With CloudFormation, with infrastructure as code, you have to request that manually, specifically. So this is a public IP address, and yep, you're going to be paying money for that for every minute that is running in your account. This is one of the reasons why we're going to use these CloudFormation templates, because you can build your network and destroy it in between the labs. The next piece is the NAT gateway itself. And in this case, the allocation ID, is going to be the related to, sorry, my little drawing here, the public IP address. I might actually be missing the allocation on my screenshots here that I was pulling off. But basically, we have to associate that elastic IP with, oh no, this is actually going to build it for us. We're going to automatically, again, this is all just part of the syntax. It will make sense. It's going to automatically say, attach this public IP to this NAT gateway. Then where do we put it? And if you remember, we always put NAT gateways in the public subnet because it has to use that internet gateway to talk to the internet itself. So 3 different pieces here: the elastic IP, the association, and then the NAT gateway itself. Then, of course, we have to have our route for our private route table. And in this case, we're saying for the private route table, take all the internet traffic and route it to the NAT gateway. just as we did by typing things into the console last week. Okay, we're almost done. And there's one last thing that is a requirement for VPCs, and I don't want to talk about it today. Required. That is NACLs, Network Access Control List. By doing things in the console last week, our NACLs were built automatically for us as we were building things out. That's not true, again, as you get into infrastructure as code. This is a control mechanism to control where network traffic can go. It's more of a security thing than a route table. We are going to talk about security groups before I start talking about NACLs. You can largely ignore them except for the thin use cases where you need them. I really try to architect things so I use them as little as possible. That's my recommendation. Try not to use the NACLs. They have to be there, but you don't have to modify them. And these NACLs are everything is open, both inbound and outbound. And that's how we're going to handle it for today. Okay, covered a lot of material. And let me just kind of go over to the side here and give you a sense again of the different components that we built and the different dependencies on the VPC. So we used CloudFormation and we used YAML. And let me give myself some blank space on the screen here. First, we defined our VPC. Then we defined our internet gateway. And then we connected those together with an attachment. Then we had a couple of things that we had to have for our VPC. And remember, the internet gateway is optional, but in our case, we had it. So the DHCP option set, which probably shouldn't use OS, but I'm going to use it today. And then that also connected to the VPC with an attachment. Then we started building out our subnets, and our subnets, we had our public and our private, and each of these had route tables, and each of those had an attachment, or sorry, an association. Here, let me do it this way. An association. And then also for each route table, we had routes. And routes. And for our public subnet, routed to the internet gateway. For our private, we also we had an elastic IP. We're renting an IP address, and we had our NAT gateway. And these are attached together, and all of our private subnets are routed to the internet through that. Okay, that's a lot. I threw a lot at you. For this one, it may be better for you to go read the blog post instead of watching the video, but hopefully my descriptions help. And we only covered the basics, so the names, the required properties, the optional properties. We've covered all of those. We talked about what a reference is. We talked a bit about what a dependency is. We used our first function, which is that get AZs, and the select, which is, again, another function. Is just selecting from the get AZs results that are in there. So there's a lot you can do with CloudFormation. Let's go ahead. We're going to build it out. I'm going to give you options to do this in two ways. You can either cut and paste the entire template out of the blog post, or you can build it piece by piece and you can explore things. At the end, we're going to shut it all down so you don't have any bills from week to week if that's how you're progressing through these labs. Let's get to it. This lab is going to be a little bit of a choose your own adventure. I'm going to show you your different options and then let you run with it. And I'm going to go pretty quickly through one of those options. It'll make sense as we jump in. All right, let's go to our browser. First thing you want to do is we are going to build this in our test account 1 again, and that's where we're doing like a lot of this experimental work. Go in with administrator access. As I mentioned, we're going to deploy with CloudFormation. I strongly recommend you use US West Oregon and just get in that habit. Remember, we only have East or West that'll even work for us. Everything else will fail out thanks to our service control policy. For this, we're going to go into CloudFormation. That's how we're going to build this out. There's actually a cool thing in there though. Last time I just had you link to my CloudFormation template that was in an S3 bucket. In this case, if we go to create stack, we're not going to choose an existing template. We're going to build from the application composer. This isn't something I use much for real, but it is something I use a fair bit when I'm building out labs. And we're going to create a template in the application composer. This is cool because it gives you a bit of a drag and drop option like, ooh, I need an API gateway. Let me drop that in and set my parameters and everything else. And we're going to go ahead and take advantage of this, but we're going to click on this template tab. And let me delete this out. That was just there because yours should be clean when you first go into it. And I want to make sure you're set. So make sure that you are on YAML. So that switches on the YAML side. And this is going to allow us to paste our template in. There's two ways that you can go about doing this. Now, I've pulled up the blog post for this in preview mode. It's going to look differently when you're actually going to it because I haven't finished writing it yet. I haven't gotten all the instructions in. And if you scroll down to where I start having the template components. So let's take this. I'm going to copy it. And then I'm going to go and paste it. I've got the first part of my template there. Hit enter. All right. Then I'm going to go back to here and I'm going to copy out my resources block and my first resource, which is the VPC itself. Then I'm going to go ahead and swap back over into here and I have my resource. Now I'm going to stop right here and let's try a validate and see what happens. So this is valid. So it means it's actually valid code. And if I look over on the canvas side, boom, look at that. Standard component, S.L.A.W VPC. Let me go back to the template and then I'm going to paste in a couple of other pieces. First thing is let's add our internet gateway. And this is going to be a cool little section of this. So add the internet gateway copy, go over, hit enter. Now I'm going to have to back all the way up because spacing matters. And I'm going to go paste, make sure these things are lined up. And if I validate, it's going to tell me if they're not lined up. All right. Now, if I go over to the canvas, you'll see I have an internet gateway, but nothing is like connected. So let's go back to the template and let's go back to my infrastructure as code and let's see what happens when I apply. So let me copy that. And then I go over, hit enter, back it all up again, paste it in, validate. Oops, I've got a bit of an invalid. So let me take a look at this. Invalid template property or properties, S.L.A.W attach gateway. And why? Because look at that. Didn't line it up properly. And this is one of the annoying things about working with infrastructure as code. So I've got to line that up there. All the other ones line up. Let's try my validation again. And this time it worked. So I was just one space off. And that was probably actually a good lesson. Save you some problems yourself. Let's go to the canvas. Oh, look at this. Isn't that nice? It actually has now linked these pieces together. And if I go, oh, never mind. Oops, I'm doing things I don't want to be doing. If I go to details, it'll actually show me the different parts of that. And you'll notice this is all the resource stuff that we've already set. Let me go back to template and let me delete that metadata I added. That was like a visual thing. So, oops, I deleted more than I wanted to. Nope, I actually deleted everything I wanted to. So now if I go to the canvas, things show differently because I've got stuff linked together and you can see the internet gateway and the attached gateway are now embedded there where they were separate before. Okay. What I'm going to do though is a big cheat right now. You can go through and you can build all of this by hand and make sure you understand the components and the relationships. But I'm going to go back over to the blog post because your other option is if you go all the way down further, eventually I have the entire template here. So select all of it. Now this makes the lab go really fast if you do it this way, but you're probably not going to learn as much but it's your choice. I'm not your parent. Well, unless one of my kids is watching right now. All right, so I just pasted the entire thing in. So this is everything that we talked about. I'm going to hit validate. It is valid. And if I go back to the canvas, look at that. Is this cool or what? It actually used to do a really bad job of how it displayed. This is the first time I've used this in a couple of years, actually. And you can see it shows all of these different relationships and how it ties together. And how everything is part of that one VPC. And I've got my public private. It doesn't always break things out in a way that you might want or you might understand. You can actually click that arrange button to arrange things differently. There's a lot you can do. Okay, we know it works. Oh, and the designer is the old version. We're using the current version, which is, I think, a lot nicer. Now, we have our template here, but this is just all kind of stored in memory right now. We have to hit create template. Now, this is what it's going to do, and this is really important. It's going to create the template, and it's going to create a bucket. CloudFormation templates with a name. So this is the internal services talking to each other. And we are going to pay for this. Trust me, it's not going to cost you anything. We're still way on the free tier for our S3 stuff. And you can pick your own bucket. So when I confirm and continue to CloudFormation, watch what happens here. It's taken that template and it actually saves it out into a URL. Now here's the trick. If you want to keep reusing this template, copy out this URL and paste it someplace you can remember it. It's always going to be in your S3 buckets. You can get to it later. So I'm going to copy that out and then I'm going to pause and go paste that someplace to remind myself because we're going to be using this probably in future labs. Okay, I went and pasted that in my little notes app so I would have access to that later. So now it's just the same as choose an existing template URL, just like we did before. But instead of running off of one in my account, this is now running inside your account. Don't worry, that's not set for public. It's set for private internally. This is not always great for security and enterprise deployments. It's really totally fine for development and testing environments as you're figuring things out. And we could actually review that template. And any template you load up here, you can always view in the application composer. If you want to start looking at, when I throw you a template, if you want to see what it's doing, that's a nice little cheat so you can actually evaluate it. Let's click next. So for the stack details, let's just call it S.L.A.W. Remember, you're all giving me free marketing every time you do that. Click next. Oh, and I had mentioned parameters before. You saw that on the previous screen. We won't go into that. Nothing to change here. Go to click next. Prerequisites. The template is ready. There's the URL. We have our description. Remember that description comes from the template itself. So it just kind of embeds that in there for us. No parameters to be dealing with. No options. Scroll all the way down. Click submit. Okay, now it's building it. And I'm going to pause while it builds it because it'll take a few minutes to get through all of this. Everything is deployed, and you notice I flicked over to the events so you can actually see as it created everything. And if you want to spend some time, you can actually look at the order of which all of that was created. You also can always pull up the template and you can pull it up in the composer. This is really good to know for security purposes because you want to be able to review these. And this gives you a way of finding out what did that template actually do. This tells me what did I tell it to do. And then this tells me what did it what did it actually do? And then this is what resources were created. So these are the actual outcomes of all of the different bits and pieces of that template. So pretty cool. All right, now let's go over to VPC and look at what we built. And this part's going to be pretty boring because you'll see we have one VPC. And if I click on it, it's called S.L.A.W. And let's go ahead, click on that arrow, click on the resource map. Remember, we used this last week. And this looks nearly identical to what we built in the console. So I have my public subnets 1 and 2, public private in US West 2A. I have a public and private in 2B. It's important to split across those for reasons that will come into play, especially within when we get to like load balancers, where you want to have a pairing between a public and a private subnet. If you're going to do anything internet facing, you always want to have a public and a private subnet paired in the same availability zone. And then we have our route tables. Now you notice we have the ones we created. Then there's this other one, no subnet associations. That's just that default route table that's automatically built. We didn't need it. We didn't use it. It's just sitting there. And if you want, you could actually click on that. It'll open up a new window. You can see it just says local. That's just really kind of like a backstop. There's no subnet associations, but it is associated with the VPC. So it actually works as the main route table, but anything that you build in your subnets is going to, I believe, override that. And then we have our internet gateway and we have our NAT gateway for our outside connections. Great. A lot of fun. We got to see all of it. Let's just go delete it. Let's get rid of it. We'll go back to services, back to CloudFormation. And again, this was all about teaching you how to explore it. The lecture was more important in a lot of ways than the labs here. I have my CloudSlaw stack. I'm going to go CloudSlaw, delete, delete. Now I'm going to pause here because sometimes there are hiccups. And let's see what happens. So let's click on it. And it says delete is in progress. We'll pause and we'll see how it goes. But you could actually track all of that by clicking on the events and hitting that refresh button. And it's going to tell you what it's doing. Everything is done. You'll notice that stack is not there anymore. So the only reason I see anything here is because I still had it open. If I click this refresh, let's see if it actually works. Didn't really refresh anything. And let me close that. Go to stacks. My stack's gone. Now I'm not going to have to pay for anything. I'm all set. Here's what I hope you got out of this week. A lot more talking than usual and diagramming and walking around. But hey, it's training. Sometimes that's going to happen. I want you to understand at a deeper level all the internal bits and pieces. You got to learn about the option sets, the associations and attachments, and all the details about route tables and associating a route table and then putting the routes in the route table. That's how Amazon sees these things. And you get a much better sense of it when you're actually writing things out in code and infrastructure as code. We also learned some of the fundamentals of infrastructure as code. And you actually learned how to use that. We didn't use the visual builder, but we did get a quick look at it to validate templates. And you can go ahead and play with that and see how all the different pieces fit together. Way too much talking for this week. I got a whole bunch of video to edit for you guys now, and we'll talk to you soon.